All right, so next question. To whom ought I to look as a role model in my journey towards liberation? What is the ideal of the Buddhist saint in Theravada Buddhism? Well, the ideal saint in Theravada Buddhism is a term called an Arhat, A-R-H-A-T. And an Arhat is one who has undone all the cycles undone all attachments in this life physically, and upon um, the dissolution of the body will become a Tathagata, a thus gone, one who has simply passed away, vanished. Now, you might wonder, why on earth should I ever look to that as my model? Because that just sounds horrifying, right? One who is utterly dissolved, this is what I should aspire towards? Well, the Theravada response to this is sort of twofold. The first is to say, of course you find it horrifying. That's the reason that you suffer, is because you identify yourself and all the things you want with things that couldn't possibly be. You identify yourself with these craving sensations you have. I mean, that's what the fire sermon was about, right? In the readings. And given that that's the case, when you look to this individual who has quenched all these desires, you find yourself horrified. So, of course, it seems horrifying to you, not because there's anything wrong with the Arhat. The Arhat is passed on. The Arhat is neither this nor that. The Arhat has vanished. But rather, it's a reflection upon your situation. Now that leads to the second point, which is to say, all right, well, even if I accept that, then what am I supposed to do with this Buddhist saint? Well, what you're supposed to do is not look to this Buddhist saint as being some sort of special person, some sort of someone who has something that you don't have, someone who has something that's sacred. None of this really ultimately makes sense. Certainly within the cultures, Theravada cultures, there is a reference for those who seem to be seriously pursuing this and are closer to nirvana, as it were, than others. I mean, you go to Thailand, for instance, and you will find a profound reverence for the monks. But that's a misleading thing, because it doesn't actually have to do with anything inside of the monks ultimately, and the monks will be the first ones to tell you that. Rather, what it is that the Arhat and those who are in serious pursuit of the Arhat, the monks, the bhikshus is the name for a monk in Buddhism. These are individuals who serve as, if you like, beacons or markers on the horizon of the world as we find ourselves trapped in this world of suffering, where we're buffeted again and again and again because of our ignorance, because of our delusion, in this sea of grasping, of craving. And it's very easy to get lost, and it's very easy to see that horizon in a way that almost gets us, turned around and convoluted. I mean, to be conscious, to be a self such as a self is, I'll emphasize that word, in Buddhism, is a very disorienting and difficult thing. All the saint does, all the monk does, is provide us an opportunity, a way in which to organize and orient our thinking, our being, our life, so that we might come to clarify and still our minds, so that we might be more mindful, so that we might find some kind of meditation, right? Some kind of stilling and slowing of these increasingly craving and reiterative qualities of our minds and our senses. That's all they are. It's a beacon, it's a lighthouse. And this is something that's very, very important to keep in mind. There is and could be ultimately nothing special about a Buddhist saint, about a monk, or even about the Buddha himself in Theravada Buddhism. There couldn't be, because there's no substance as such to these things. But that doesn't make them any less necessary, because those are the tools that we use, some of the tools that we use ultimately to help us, when we look into ourselves, orient towards our situation and on our journey. All right, so there's that. I guess the other thing I'd want to say in this short podcast time that we have here is to raise this question of the notion of the self. I've already alluded to it a little bit here, but in Theravada Buddhism, the idea of the self, the Anatman, is that what we take to be the self is merely a byproduct of all of these activities, right? It's a byproduct of our thinking, of our craving, of our grasping. It's the twine of the skand that's coming together in a particular way. And as such, there really is nothing to it. It's something that sort of regenerates it's the generation and regeneration, perpetual regeneration of a delusion. One famous place you see this is something I already mentioned in the fire sermon, the way in which the conscious mind tends to identify itself with its senses, with its desires, with its fears, with its aspirations, with its depression, with this motion, when in fact it couldn't be any particular one of these things. And that's a classical description of it. But you know, there's another description, I think, of the self in Theravada Buddhism that might help also, or that I could bring to Theravada Buddhism, although they never mention it. You know what it is? It's of a hologram. You know, if you've ever seen a hologram, I mean, they're such fascinating things. It's the way in which they use refraction and reflection of light in order to make it appear as though there's a three-dimensional object in front of you, when in fact there is no three-dimensional object. And what's happening is you're simply apprehending this object in a particular way, right? You're just seeing it in a particular way, taking it in a particular way. But in fact, there's nothing there. All there is light bending. And in the bending, it makes it seem as though there's something there, and we misunderstand it. Well, this is what you have with Theravada Buddhism looking at the self. It seems as though there's something there because there's this perpetual grasping and craving. But there is no self there. The grasping and craving just reiterates this illusion, and we can see this quite clearly when we are capable of being mindful. How do we do that? By looking to the role models that we have, these Buddhist saints, by practicing mindfulness, by meditation, by doing all those things that start with ourself, looking at our situation, caring for it, and trying to bring ourselves to a place where we can be really clear with what this is. That's what we're left with. And when we do that, we see that this self that we are so attached to, that generates so much suffering and grief again and again and again, that is always craving after and grasping after things that could not possibly be by virtue of the nature of things, need not be any of these things at all, right? But in order to do that, in order to get to that, we need to find a way in which to bring our mind to be in a position to accept that. And one of the ways to do that is to recognize precisely what the self is, a byproduct of this activity that, when looked at wrongly, has nothing to it at all. Okay, I'll move on to the last two questions here in the next podcast.